During the garden planning process, probably one of the biggest questions that you're going to come up with is, how do I decide where to put all these plants? I already know what I want to plant, but how do I arrange it in my garden in a way that makes sense? And so today we're going to go over step one of that process, where we're going to start grouping plants by some of the things they have in common, and that's going to help you start deciding where in your garden they should go. If you've been following along with the course, which if you haven't, I will link it below. This entire course is for free here on YouTube just for you. But if you've been following along with the course, then in the last lesson that we did, we talked about mapping out your space and specifically about mapping out where the shade is. And this is important because plants have different sunlight needs. And so one of the first things we're going to do is we are going to separate our plants by how much sunlight they need. And that usually is in three main categories. There's full sun, there's partial sun, and then there is tolerant of shade pretty much all the time. And so most of the plants that you're trying to grow are going to fit in the full sun and partial sun categories. You might end up with a couple over here in shade loving, but generally the sort of stuff we tend to grow in gardens tends to like a lot of sun. So for something to qualify as a full sun plant, it is going to be 6 or more hours of direct sunlight per day. And that is 6 hours of the sun actually coming straight down and hitting the leaf. And then if you move into the partial sun category, that is going to be about 3 to 6 hours of direct sunlight that plant is going to need. And anything that needs less than 3 hours is going to be in the shade category. And so as you are putting your plants into those groupings, you can start looking at the sketch that we made in the last video and thinking about what areas correspond to full sun, partial sun, and full shade. So for me in my garden, the left side of the garden is pretty much full shade, and the right side of the garden is pretty much full sun. And then there in the middle is sort of what I would say partial to full sun. It definitely gets shade at certain parts of the day, but it is not shady all day like it is all the way over to the far left. Out of all the groupings we're going to do today, this one is probably the most important, the biggest factor for success for your plants, because you can do everything else right with your plants, but if it's not getting enough sunlight, it's still going to be kind of sad and it might even die altogether. And often, same goes for the shade-loving plants. If they are evolved to be in the shade and you put them in full sun, they will probably get burned to death. So just definitely take this into heavy consideration when you are arranging plants in your garden. All right, the next thing I want to look at with you is the soil needs of each plant. And this doesn't have to be super specific. We're just going for kind of 3 major categories here: loamy, sandy, and clay soils. And what this is going to do is this is going to help inform you about whether or not you are going to need to put something in a raised bed, or if it's going to do well in the existing ground that you already have. And that is going to create kind of a separation for you naturally as to where certain plants can go. As a general rule, most plants are really going to like loamy soil. This is soil that is rich in organic matter and nutrients. It holds water well, but is still pretty well draining. It's kind of the Goldilocks zone of soil. It is the best of everything, but that is not necessarily good for all plants. So if you want to grow root vegetables, for instance, you're going to want to tend towards the sandier side of stuff because it is going to be kind of a lighter, fluffier soil, and it is also going to drain a lot more readily than a loamy soil, and that's something that the root vegetables do really like. Meanwhile, other plants actually do thrive in a heavy clay soil, so that is something that holds water really, really well. It's kind of dense, and it is very, very packed with nutrients, but they are, sometimes a little bit harder to get to than in the other soils. So things that really like clay soil that are very common, like onions and garlic, all of these different alliums, really like the clay soil. And you're just going to go through your list and do a quick Google search of kind of what the ideal soil type for each of the plants that you're growing is. And then again, keep this in mind as you're deciding where in your garden things are going to be. The easiest way to give something soil that is very specific to its needs is to put it in a raised bed somewhere. And beyond that, you are kind of working with the ground that you have. You can amend it a little bit. And one of the major things that I would recommend you do, no matter what kind of soil you're starting with, is a good layer of compost for just that nutrition and that organic matter that most plants generally really like. One other notable exception that I'm going to mention, because you might run into other exceptions like this, is a nasturtium. It's a type of flower that I've been growing for a while. It is edible. The flowers are edible, the leaves are edible, the little seed pods are edible, and it is gorgeous, but it actually thrives in poor soil, low nutrients. So if you put it in that really ideal soil, it will not flower nearly as much as it would in a poor soil, and that is just a specific adaptation of that plant. So definitely go through all of your plants and look out for stuff like that as you're kind of sorting them into different categories. All right, and the third way that I think you should group your plants is by their watering needs. Plants range all the way from drought tolerant to very thirsty. So I think splitting it into kind of just 3 main categories is already going to give you a really good idea of what type of watering needs that plant is going to have. So drought resistant plants, things like, I have figs and grapes and eggplant on there, and you can often find some like very specific varieties of plants that are, bred to be more drought tolerant than the regular variety of that plant. So if you do live in a region that doesn't get rain very much and you don't want to offer a ton of extra water, you might be looking into that. And then on the opposite side of things, you have things that are very thirsty. So basil and cucumbers are very good examples of thirsty plants. Marshmallow is a marsh plant. It actually kind of likes having what we call wet feet, which is where the soil stays pretty damp all the time. And you can imagine that if you put a really thirsty plant next to a drought tolerant plant, that they would not have a good time being on the same watering schedule. And so definitely grouping by water needs is going to help you be more efficient in watering your garden and help each plant be just a little bit more successful with the environment that it's in. You can create these sort of microclimates in your garden. So for example, we were talking about in the last video, that low spot in my garden. That is where I'm going to put a lot of thirsty stuff, is kind of on that side. My garden is also slightly on a hill, so thirstier stuff kind of more downhill makes just a little bit more sense for me because the water is collecting down there. But in whatever shape of garden that you're working with, it is worth considering. Maybe if you're working flat, you put all the very thirsty plants closest to where your water comes from, just so that it's really easy and convenient for you if there aren't other limiting factors as far as these other groupings that we're talking about. And as we're getting into the weeds of this, pun fully intended, I want you to remember that it doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to have the plant getting the perfect amount of sun with the perfect amount of water in the perfect soil. We are trying to optimize these things, but they don't have to be absolutely perfect for your garden to still do really well. If you were to just not consider these things at all, you would probably have a bad time. But the fact that we are sitting here considering it and just trying to do our best with the resources that we have, that is going to make a huge difference for your garden. So that being said, I'm going to move on to the final category that I think you should split your plants into, and that is by size and or growth habit. So plants can grow into a lot of different shapes, right? We have things that grow all the way up into trees and things that stay really low to the ground and things that are somewhere in between. We have bushes and vines, etc., etc. And so I think you should separate your plants into kind of about how big they get and what that growth habit is. The growth habit specifically is going to come in handy in the next lesson, but for now we are looking at whether something becomes a tree, a shrub, a vine, whether it is kind of short or whether it is fully very close to the ground, like a ground cover. And this is going to help you decide where things go in a variety of ways. So the first way is, like we said before about the sunlight, if you put a tall plant next to a shorter plant and you don't orient them properly with where the sun is, then that tall plant can end up shading the smaller plant. And so that's something that you have to consider as you are arranging your garden. generally what you're looking at is trying to arrange your rows such that they are not directly perpendicular. I guess that would be perpendicular to the sun. So if your rows are this way and this is your sun and the sun comes up and over this way, then as the sun is over here, this is going to be shading that way. And as the sun comes over here, this is going to be shading that way. So if you flip it like this and your sun is coming this way, then there's a much skinnier portion that is shading, and it is only kind of just shading the plant next to it in that same row that is probably of similar height. So thinking about how tall something is going to get and whether or not you're putting it next to something that needs a lot of sun does need to be considered. And you can actually hack the system a little bit with this. You can say, okay, well, I am going to put this tall thing here where it's going to shade this shorter thing over here, and I'm going to do that on purpose because the shorter thing doesn't need as much sunlight. And that is something that you can very intentionally do with your garden. It's definitely not necessary to be thinking about all those little things as we're planning our very first garden, but if you really want to get into it, you can absolutely plan things down to little details like that. Knowing about how big your plants are going to get is also going to just simply help you inform where you even have room in your space to put them. The size of a mature fig tree is going to vary a lot from the size of a mature lettuce plant, right? And one of those is going to be there forever, like a perennial, right? Like we talked about earlier. And one of them is going to be killed by the frost every year. And then you can decide to put it in a new place. So knowing how big things are going to get, the annual versus perennial, these are all factors that are going to help you consider how you're arranging stuff. And then even one level deeper than that, if you want to go there, you can definitely think about planting your shorter stuff underneath your taller stuff. You'll find that a lot of very short stuff is tolerant of less sunlight because that's kind of the way that things evolved. The really, really tall things competed for the sunlight because that's what they got. And then everything below it kind of adapted to that lower sunlight life. And if you start arranging things like that in levels, you might find that you can actually fit a lot more into your space than you originally would have thought. So a big example of this in my garden is I have all of my berry bushes, and then I have strawberries underneath my berry bushes. And these are a low growing plant, and they also are tolerant of partial shade. So they can be there kind of taking up that ground space that, if you were thinking in a more traditional way, is like technically already taken up by the berry plants. And I now have two different plants in that same space. All right, so your homework for the day is to go through and do all the different groupings for your plants. If you're following along in the planner, you will see kind of a spreadsheet looking page like this. There's definitely several different ways to go about this. So if filling out a page like this doesn't speak to you, feel free to do whatever makes sense for you, especially an actual spreadsheet is a really good option that I can think of a lot of people in my life that would prefer to go that way. I'm definitely more of a paper and pencil person, but just make sure that it's somewhere where you can easily digest the information and you can easily reference it. Now, in the next video coming up, we are going to address something that I think a lot of gardeners wait until it's absolutely dire to do anything about instead of planning for it ahead of time. And it's mostly because it's easily forgotten, and that is going to be support or trellising options. It's much easier to build that in from the very beginning than to kind of react to your plants already being too big and flopping all over the place. So we're going to get into that next time, and until then, I wish you guys all happy gardening.